Marcus Thompson had always known that serving in the Royal Guard meant facing the unexpected. Standing at 6 feet 2 inches with shoulders that filled his ceremonial uniform perfectly, he carried himself with the quiet confidence that came from years of rigorous training. But nothing in his preparation had quite readied him for the chaos that was about to unfold on this ordinary Tuesday morning in front of Buckingham Palace. The day had started like any other. Marcus arrived at the barracks before dawn, his polished boots clicking against the stone floors as he made his way to the briefing room. The morning briefing was routine, standard protocols, weather updates, and the day's schedule of events. The Queen was hosting a delegation of foreign diplomats, which meant heightened security, but nothing beyond their usual capabilities. Marcus took his position at the main gate, his red tunic immaculate and his bearskin hat positioned perfectly. Tourists were already gathering, cameras ready to capture the iconic British tradition. Children pressed their faces against the iron railings, hoping to catch a glimpse of the guards in their magnificent uniforms. It was a scene that played out every day, year after year. The first sign of trouble came at 11:30. Marcus noticed unusual movement in his peripheral vision. Groups of people were gathering at the far end of the mall, their voices carrying on the morning breeze. What started as scattered clusters quickly grew into a crowd. Within minutes, hundreds of protesters were marching toward the palace, their chants growing louder with each step. Through his earpiece, Marcus heard the crackle of urgent communications. Intelligence reports were coming in fast. This was no ordinary demonstration. The crowd was larger than anticipated, and there were reports of agitators within the group who had no intention of keeping things peaceful. The Metropolitan Police had been monitoring the situation, but something had gone wrong with their crowd control measures. Marcus remained motionless at his post, his training taking over. Years of discipline had taught him to maintain his composure, regardless of external circumstances. But beneath his stoic exterior, every sense was heightened. He could feel the tension building like electricity in the air before a storm. The protesters were now visible from the palace gates. They carried banners and signs, their voices unified in angry chants about economic policies and government decisions. Most appeared to be ordinary citizens exercising their right to peaceful protest, but Marcus could identify the troublemakers among them. There were individuals whose body language suggested they were looking for confrontation, their movements aggressive and purposeful. The crowd swelled to over 1,000 people, far exceeding what the initial police barriers could contain. Marcus watched as the thin blue line of officers tried to maintain order, but they were clearly outnumbered. The protesters pushed forward, and the carefully maintained distance between them and the palace began to shrink rapidly. Then everything changed in an instant. A group of agitators at the front of the crowd suddenly surged forward, breaking through the police barriers. What had been a controlled demonstration erupted into chaos as people scattered in different directions. Some protesters tried to maintain their peaceful stance, but others were swept up in the momentum of the surge. The sound of breaking glass echoed across the courtyard as bottles were thrown. Smoke began to rise from what appeared to be flares or small fires. The morning air filled with shouts, screams, and the sharp blast of police whistles. Marcus could see officers struggling to regain control, but the situation was spiraling beyond their capabilities. Through his earpiece, Marcus heard the call he had been trained for but hoped never to experience. Code red, all units to emergency positions. Riot police en route. The words sent a surge of adrenaline through his system, but his exterior remained unchanged. This was what years of training had prepared him for. The crowd was now pressing against the palace gates themselves. Marcus could see the fear in the eyes of the tourists who had been caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. Families with children were trying to move away from the growing violence, but the crowd dynamics made escape difficult for many. More concerning were the individuals who seemed to have a specific agenda. Marcus identified at least 6 people who were moving with military precision through the chaos, their focus clearly on the palace defenses rather than the general protest. These were not ordinary demonstrators caught up in the moment. They were organized and dangerous. The sound of approaching sirens grew louder as emergency services rushed to the scene. But Marcus knew that help, while coming, might not arrive in time to prevent the situation from escalating further. The thin line between a protest and a riot had already been crossed, and now it threatened to become something much worse. As he maintained his position, Marcus felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. Behind these gates was not just a building or a symbol, but people whose safety depended on his training and judgment. The tourists, the staff, the dignitaries inside, all were counting on the royal guard to stand firm against whatever chaos might come. The protesters were now climbing the barriers, and Marcus could see that some had weapons, clubs, chains, and other improvised tools of violence. The peaceful nature of the original demonstration had been completely overwhelmed by the actions of those who had come with darker intentions. In the distance, Marcus could hear the distinctive sound of Riot police vehicles approaching. Their arrival would change the dynamic completely, but it would also create new challenges. The interaction between different security forces in a high-pressure situation required precise coordination to avoid tragedy. As the crowd pressed closer to the gates, Marcus made eye contact with his fellow guards. No words were needed. They all understood what was at stake. Years of training, tradition, and duty converged in this moment. Whatever happened next would test everything they had learned and everything they believed in about their role as protectors of the crown and the people of Britain. The Riot police sirens were getting closer, but so was the angry crowd. In the next few minutes, Marcus would discover whether his training was enough to handle a situation that no manual could fully prepare him for. The sound of heavy boots on asphalt announced their arrival before Marcus could see them. 3 Riot police vans screeched to a halt just beyond the outer perimeter, their blue lights casting an eerie glow across the chaotic scene. From his position at the palace gates, Marcus watched as dozens of officers in full tactical gear poured out of the vehicles, their movements swift and coordinated. The Riot police were an imposing sight. Dressed in black protective gear with helmets that covered their faces, they carried shields and batons as they formed a disciplined line. Their commander, a tall man with the bearing of a military veteran, immediately began barking orders through a megaphone. The message was clear and direct. The crowd needed to disperse immediately or face arrest, but the crowd was beyond listening to reason. The initial surge had created a momentum of its own, and the more aggressive elements were now firmly in control. Marcus watched as bottles and rocks flew through the air, some striking the Riot police shields with sharp cracks. The officers held their formation, but he could see the tension building as they prepared for what seemed like an inevitable confrontation. Through his earpiece, Marcus received updated intelligence that made his blood run cold. Security services had identified at least 12 individuals in the crowd who were known extremists with histories of violence. These were not spontaneous protesters caught up in the moment, but organized agitators who had planned to use the demonstration as cover for something much more serious. The Royal Guard had protocols for exactly this type of situation, but Marcus had never imagined implementing them under such chaotic conditions. His training had covered crowd control, but this was beyond what any simulation could recreate. The unpredictability of real violence, the innocent people caught in the middle, and the potential for international incident if things went wrong, all of these factors weighed heavily on his mind. The crowd had now completely surrounded the Riot police, creating a dangerous dynamic where the officers found themselves trapped between the protesters and the palace gates. Marcus could see that the police commander was trying to create an escape route for his men, while maintaining some semblance of order, but the crowd was pressing in from all sides. Suddenly, a group of protesters broke away from the main crowd and rushed directly toward the palace gates where Marcus stood. These individuals moved with purpose and coordination that suggested they had planned this specific action. Marcus counted 8 of them, all young men dressed in dark clothing with their faces partially covered. The moment Marcus had trained for his entire career had arrived. Every drill, every simulation, every lecture about duty and responsibility crystallized into this single instant. His hand moved instinctively to his sidearm while his mind rapidly calculated the threat level and appropriate response. The approaching group was shouting anti-monarchy slogans, but their actions suggested something far more serious than political protest. One of them was carrying what appeared to be a crowbar, while another had something in his hand that could have been an explosive device. Marcus made the split-second decision that would define everything that followed. "Stand back from the gates," Marcus shouted, his voice carrying the authority of his training and position. "This is your only warning." The group ignored his command and continued their advance. The individual with the crowbar raised it above his head, clearly intending to use it against the gate mechanism or possibly against Marcus himself. In that moment, training took over completely, pushing aside any hesitation or doubt. Marcus stepped forward from his ceremonial position, his movement fluid and precise. The years of martial arts training, weapons proficiency, and tactical response drills had prepared him for exactly this moment. He wasn't just a ceremonial guard in a fancy uniform. He was a highly trained soldier sworn to protect not just the monarchy, but the rule of law itself. The confrontation at the gates drew the attention of both the riot police and the main crowd. Marcus found himself at the center of a rapidly escalating situation, where any wrong move could result in serious injury or death. The 8 attackers had now reached the gates and their intentions were clearly hostile. Behind him, Marcus could hear the sound of additional royal guards taking emergency positions. The palace's internal security protocols were now fully activated, transforming the ceremonial posting into a legitimate military defensive position. The contrast between the morning's peaceful tourism and the current crisis seemed almost surreal. The Riot police commander had noticed the situation at the gates and was trying to redirect some of his officers to assist, but his own men were pinned down by the crowd's aggressive behavior. Bottles and rocks continued to rain down on them, and Marcus could see that several officers had already been injured. The man with the crowbar was now close enough that Marcus could see his eyes, cold, determined, and completely focused on causing damage. This wasn't the look of someone caught up in the heat of protest emotion. This was someone who had come with a specific mission and the willingness to use violence to accomplish it. Marcus drew his sidearm in a smooth, practiced motion that spoke of countless hours of training. The weapon felt familiar and reassuring in his hand, but he hoped desperately that he wouldn't need to use it. The sight of an armed royal guard caused a momentary pause in the attackers' advance, but Marcus could see they were regrouping for another rush. The crowd behind the 8 attackers had noticed the weapon and was beginning to react with a mixture of fear and increased anger. Some people were trying to move away from the potential violence, while others seemed energized by the escalation. The situation was balanced on a knife's edge, with any sudden movement potentially triggering a catastrophe. Through the chaos, Marcus heard the sound of additional sirens approaching. More police units were arriving, but so were more protesters. The demonstration had clearly grown beyond what anyone had anticipated, and social media was undoubtedly spreading news of the confrontation in real time, potentially drawing even more people to the scene. The man with the crowbar took another step forward, and Marcus knew that the moment of decision had arrived. Everything he had learned, everything he believed in, and everything he was sworn to protect came down to the next few seconds. Time seemed to slow as Marcus faced the advancing attackers. The man with the crowbar was now less than 10 feet away, his weapon raised and his intention clear. Behind him, the other 7 members of the group had spread out, attempting to flank Marcus and create multiple points of attack. Their coordination confirmed what Marcus had suspected. This was a planned assault, not a spontaneous act of protest. Marcus's training took over completely. His mind processed the tactical situation with crystal clarity, while his body moved with the precision of countless drills. He shifted his stance to a defensive position that would allow him to engage multiple attackers while protecting his flanks. The ceremonial nature of his post had vanished entirely, replaced by the reality of armed combat. "I said stand back," Marcus shouted again, his voice cutting through the noise of the crowd. "Drop your weapons and move away from the gates." The man with the crowbar responded by charging forward with a wild swing aimed at Marcus's head, but Marcus was ready. He sidestepped the attack with fluid grace, using the attacker's momentum against him. In one smooth motion, Marcus struck the man's wrist with a precise blow that sent the crowbar clattering across the pavement. The other attackers moved simultaneously, clearly following a coordinated plan. 2 came from the left while 3 approached from the right, with the remaining 2 trying to circle behind him. Marcus found himself in the exact type of multiple attacker scenario that his instructors had drilled into him repeatedly during training. Marcus's years of close-quarters combat training proved their worth. He moved like a dancer, each step calculated, to maintain optimal positioning while dealing with threats in order of priority. A knee strike disabled one attacker, while a perfectly timed elbow to another's solar plexus dropped him to the ground, gasping for air. The crowd behind the attackers had gone silent, stunned by the sudden explosion of violence. Many were recording, with their phones capturing every moment of the confrontation. Marcus was acutely aware that his actions were being documented and would be scrutinized by investigators, media, and the public. Every move had to be justified, measured, and within the bounds of his authority. The riot police had finally broken, free from the crowd's containment, and were rushing toward the gates. Marcus could see them approaching, but he knew they were still at least 30 seconds away. In close combat, 30 seconds was an eternity, especially when facing multiple determined attackers. One of the remaining attackers pulled what appeared to be a knife from his jacket. The sight of the blade changed everything. What had been a physical altercation was now a potentially lethal encounter. Marcus's hand moved instinctively to his sidearm, but his training told him to exhaust other options first. Instead of drawing his weapon, Marcus grabbed a fallen protest sign from the ground, using it as an improvised shield and weapon. The wooden handle gave him reach, while the attached banner could be used to entangle weapons or obscure an attacker's vision. It was an unconventional choice, but Marcus's training emphasized adaptability and using whatever tools were available. The knife-wielding attacker lunged forward with a vicious slash aimed at Marcus's midsection. Marcus deflected the blade with the sign's handle, while simultaneously driving his knee upward into the attacker's ribs. The impact was solid and decisive, sending the man stumbling backward and dropping his weapon. By now, 3 of the original 8 attackers were down, either unconscious or too injured to continue fighting. The remaining 5 had regrouped and were approaching more cautiously, having realized that Marcus was far more formidable than they had anticipated. Their initial confidence had been replaced by wariness and growing desperation. The riot police were now close enough for Marcus to see their faces. The lead officer was shouting something, but the noise from the crowd made it impossible to understand his words. Marcus hoped they would recognize that he was defending his post legitimately and not mistake him for part of the problem. Suddenly, one of the attackers produced something that made Marcus's blood freeze. A small cylindrical object that looked suspiciously like a grenade. Whether it was real or fake was impossible to determine in the heat of the moment, but Marcus couldn't take any chances. The threat had escalated beyond physical assault to potential terrorism. Marcus's training for dealing with explosive devices kicked in immediately. His first priority was to create distance between the device and any potential victims. The crowd of innocent protesters was still dangerously close, and an explosion could kill or injure dozens of people. "Grenade!" Marcus shouted at the top of his lungs, hoping to warn everyone in the area. "Everyone get back! Clear the area!" The effect was immediate and dramatic. The crowd, which had been pressing forward to watch the confrontation, suddenly reversed direction in a panic. People screamed and ran in all directions, creating new chaos as everyone tried to escape the potential blast zone simultaneously. The attacker with the device held it up threateningly, his thumb hovering over what appeared to be a trigger mechanism. His eyes held the fanatical gleam of someone willing to die for his cause, which made him infinitely more dangerous than the others. Marcus knew he had seconds to act. If the device was real and the man was serious about using it, countless innocent lives hung in the balance. The riot police were still too far away to intervene, and even if they weren't, their heavy gear would slow their response time. Drawing on every ounce of his training, Marcus began to close the distance to the bomber. Each step was calculated to appear non-threatening while actually positioning him for a decisive strike. The key was to neutralize the threat before the attacker could activate the device. The man with the device began shouting political slogans, his voice rising to a hysterical pitch. Marcus recognized the signs of someone working himself up to commit an irreversible act. The window for peaceful resolution was closing rapidly. Marcus feinted to the left, causing the bomber to shift his attention and body position. In that split second of distraction, Marcus launched himself forward with explosive speed. His tackle was perfectly executed, driving his shoulder into the attacker's midsection while simultaneously grabbing for the hand holding the device. The 2 men crashed to the ground with Marcus on top, both hands wrapped around the attacker's wrist to prevent him from triggering the device. The object flew from the man's grasp and skittered across the pavement, coming to rest several feet away. As Marcus pinned the would-be bomber to the ground, the riot police finally arrived at the gates. The lead officer immediately moved to secure the suspicious device while others helped Marcus restrain the remaining attackers. The immediate threat was over. But Marcus knew that the real challenge was just beginning. The device lay motionless on the concrete, its true nature still unknown. A Riot police bomb disposal expert approached it carefully, while Marcus maintained his grip on the subdued attacker. The man beneath him was still struggling, shouting incoherent threats and political slogans, but his movements were growing weaker as the adrenaline began to fade from his system. Around them, the scene was one of controlled chaos. The Riot police had formed a protective perimeter, while their colleagues worked to secure the area. The crowd of protesters had scattered in multiple directions when Marcus had shouted his warning about the grenade, but many were now regrouping at a safer distance, their cameras still recording every moment of the unfolding drama. Marcus could feel the weight of dozens of eyes upon him as he knelt over the pinned attacker. His ceremonial red tunic was torn and dirty, his bearskin hat had been knocked off during the struggle, and his usually immaculate appearance was now disheveled from combat. But more than his physical appearance had changed. The events of the last few minutes had transformed him from a ceremonial guard into something else entirely. The bomb disposal expert completed his preliminary examination of the device and gave a thumbs-up signal to his colleagues. "It's fake," he called out. "Realistic looking, but it's just a training dummy filled with sand." Relief flooded through Marcus, though he was careful not to let it show on his face. Even though the device had been fake, the threat it represented had been very real. The attackers had clearly intended to create terror and chaos, and they had nearly succeeded. The fact that they had been willing to use what they believed to be an explosive device spoke to the serious nature of their intentions. The lead Riot police officer, whose name tag read Inspector Davies, approached Marcus as additional officers took custody of the 8 attackers. Davies was a veteran with over 20 years of experience, and Marcus could see the professional respect in his eyes as he surveyed the scene. "Outstanding work, Guard Thompson," Davies said, having recognized Marcus from previous security briefings. "Your quick thinking prevented what could have been a massacre." Marcus nodded his acknowledgement but remained focused on the larger situation. The immediate threat had been neutralized, but the crowd of protesters was still present and agitated. The sight of their fellow demonstrators being arrested and the violence that had occurred was likely to inflame tensions further. Through his earpiece, Marcus received updates from the Palace Security Command Center. The royal family and visiting dignitaries had been moved to secure locations within the palace as soon as the crisis began. The morning's diplomatic meetings had been postponed indefinitely, and additional security teams were being deployed throughout London as a precautionary measure. Marcus also learned that similar incidents had occurred at other government buildings throughout the city. The attack on Buckingham Palace hadn't been an isolated event, but part of a coordinated effort to disrupt the government and create widespread chaos. Intelligence services were working frantically to determine the scope of the plot and identify any remaining threats. The arrested attackers were being processed by the Riot police, their identities checked against terrorist watch lists and criminal databases. Marcus watched as they were loaded into police vans, noting their defiant expressions and continued shouting of political slogans. These individuals clearly believed in their cause, which made them dangerous even in custody. Media vans began arriving on the scene, their reporters and camera crews eager to document the aftermath of the confrontation. Marcus knew that the footage of his fight with the attackers would be broadcast around the world within hours, subjecting his actions to intense scrutiny and analysis. Every move he had made would be examined by experts, politicians, and the general public. Inspector Davies approached Marcus again, this time with a more serious expression. "We're going to need a full debrief from you as soon as possible," he said. "Your actions today likely prevented a terrorist attack, but there will be investigations and inquiries." "Are you prepared for that?" Marcus nodded. He had been trained for exactly this type of situation, including the administrative and legal aftermath that would follow. The Royal Guard's protocols were clear about documenting every action taken during a security incident, and Marcus had maintained mental notes throughout the confrontation. Specifically for this purpose, the crowd of protesters was beginning to disperse under pressure from additional police units that had arrived to support the riot officers. Most of the demonstrators appeared to be genuinely peaceful citizens who had been caught up in events beyond their control. Many looked shocked and confused by the violence they had witnessed. their original purpose for protesting seemingly forgotten in the chaos. However, intelligence reports suggested that other organized groups might still be in the area, waiting for an opportunity to cause further disruption. Marcus remained at heightened alert despite the apparent calm, scanning the remaining crowd for signs of additional threats. A senior palace security official arrived to escort Marcus to the debrief location. As they walked through the palace gates, Marcus caught a glimpse of himself in the reflection of a window. The transformation from ceremonial guard to combat veteran was startling. His face was set in hard lines, his eyes held a sharpness that hadn't been there that morning, and his entire bearing spoke of someone who had faced genuine danger and emerged victorious. The debriefing room was filled with representatives from multiple agencies: Palace Security, Metropolitan Police MI5, and the Royal Guard's own Internal Affairs Division. Marcus recognized some faces from previous training sessions, but others were strangers whose presence indicated the serious nature of the incident. For the next 3 hours, Marcus recounted every detail of the confrontation. His training in observation and recall served him well as he described the attackers' movements, their apparent coordination, and the decisions he had made in response to each threat. The questioners were thorough but respectful, recognizing that Marcus had acted heroically under extreme pressure. The preliminary analysis of the attackers' backgrounds was disturbing. Several were known to intelligence services as members of extremist organizations with international connections. The sophistication of their planning and the coordination with similar attacks elsewhere suggested a level of organization that went far beyond domestic protest groups. As the debriefing concluded, Marcus was informed that he would likely be called to testify in court when the attackers were brought to trial. He was also told that his actions were being reviewed for possible commendation, though the final decision would depend on the results of the formal investigation. Walking back to his quarters as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the palace grounds, Marcus reflected on how dramatically his life had changed in just a few hours. That morning he had been a ceremonial guard performing traditional duties. Now he was at the center of an international incident that would likely define his career and possibly change how the Royal Guard operated in the future. The quiet corridors of the palace seemed almost surreal after the chaos of the morning. Marcus knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges as the investigation continued, and the full implications of the attack became clear. The following morning brought a media storm unlike anything Marcus had experienced in his military career. Every major news network in Britain was running footage of the confrontation, with analysts dissecting his every move. The headlines ranged from "Hero Guard Saves Palace" to more critical pieces, questioning whether excessive force had been used against protesters. Marcus sat in the Royal Guard common room, watching the coverage with a mixture of fascination and discomfort. The camera angles captured by various phones and news crews showed the fight from multiple perspectives, creating a complete picture of the violence that had unfolded. Seeing himself in action was surreal. The Marcus on the screen moved with a lethal efficiency that seemed almost foreign to the man watching. Colonel Richardson, the commanding officer of the Royal Guard, entered the room and motioned for Marcus to follow him to his office. Richardson was a decorated veteran with 30 years of service, and his expression was unreadable as they walked through the corridors. "Thompson," Richardson began once they were seated in his office, "I want you to know that preliminary reviews of your actions yesterday have been overwhelmingly positive. You followed protocol precisely, used appropriate force, and likely prevented significant casualties." Marcus felt a surge of relief, though he kept his expression neutral. "Thank you, sir. I was simply doing my duty." "Yes, well, your duty has created quite a stir," Richardson continued, sliding a folder across his desk. "These are some of the initial intelligence reports about yesterday's attackers. What we've learned is deeply concerning." Marcus opened the folder and began reading. The attackers weren't simply disgruntled protesters or local extremists. They were part of an international network that had been planning coordinated attacks on government targets across Europe. London had been just one of several planned strikes, with similar incidents having been thwarted in Paris, Berlin, and Rome. The fake grenade that Marcus had tackled the man to retrieve wasn't just a scare tactic. Intelligence analysis suggested it had been a test run for a real explosive device that would have been used in a subsequent attack. By preventing the group from completing their mission at Buckingham Palace, Marcus had potentially disrupted their entire operational timeline. The implications go far beyond what happened yesterday, Richardson explained. Your actions may have saved not just the people present at the palace, but potentially hundreds of others who would have been targeted in follow-up attacks. Marcus studied the intelligence reports more carefully. The level of planning and coordination involved was staggering. The group had conducted surveillance for months, studying guard routines, police response times, and crowd control measures. They had chosen the timing of their attack to coincide with maximum tourist presence and diplomatic activity. Most disturbing was the revelation that the attack on the Royal Guard had been intended as a recruitment and propaganda tool. The group had planned to capture or kill a guard on camera, using the footage to demonstrate their ability to strike at the heart of British institutions. Marcus's successful defense had turned their propaganda victory into a humiliating defeat. There's something else you need to know, Richardson said, his tone becoming more serious. We've received credible intelligence that the group may attempt retaliation against you personally. You're being moved to secure accommodations effective immediately, and your family has been placed under protective surveillance. The news hit Marcus like a physical blow. He had known that his actions would have consequences, but the thought of his wife and 2 young children being threatened because of his duty was almost unbearable. Sarah worked as a teacher and had no connection to his military service beyond being his spouse. His children, aged 7 and 9, were completely innocent of any involvement in yesterday's events. Sir, what are the specific threats? Marcus asked, struggling to keep his voice steady. Richardson handed him another folder. This one marked with security classifications that indicated the information came from the highest levels of intelligence gathering. Social media chatter from known extremist networks includes specific mentions of you by name. There have been attempts to identify your home address and your family's daily routines. We're taking these threats very seriously. Marcus felt a cold anger building in his chest. Fighting armed attackers in defense of his post was one thing. That was what he had trained for and accepted as part of his duty. But threatening innocent civilians, especially children, crossed a line that transformed this from a matter of duty into something deeply personal. What are the protective measures? Marcus inquired, forcing himself to focus on practical matters rather than his emotional response. Your family is being relocated to a safe house outside London. They've been told it's a precautionary measure related to your involvement in yesterday's incident. We haven't shared the specific nature of the threats with them. That decision is yours to make. Marcus nodded, understanding the wisdom of that approach. Sarah was strong and capable, but knowing that extremists were actively plotting against their family would be terrifying for anyone. The children were too young to understand the complexities of the situation. Additionally, Richardson continued, we're implementing enhanced security protocols for all Royal Guards who were present yesterday. This isn't just about you. The entire unit is potentially at risk. The weight of responsibility was crushing. Marcus's successful defense had protected the palace and disrupted a terrorist network, but it had also painted a target on the backs of his colleagues and family. Every guard who had stood with him yesterday was now potentially in danger because of the enemies his actions had made. Richardson seemed to read his thoughts. Thompson, I want to be clear about something. You did exactly what you were supposed to do. You protected your post, defended innocent civilians, and upheld the honor of the Guard. The fact that criminals and terrorists are angry about it only proves that you did the right thing. Marcus appreciated the colonel's words, but they didn't diminish his concern for the people he cared about. When can I see my family, sir? This afternoon. You'll be escorted to the safe house for a brief visit. We need to maintain the illusion that you're following normal routines, so extended absence would actually increase the risk. The morning briefing included updates on the investigation and the broader security situation. 3 more members of the extremist network had been arrested in dawn raids across London. Computer equipment and communications devices seized in the raids were providing intelligence services with valuable insights into the group's structure and planned operations. International cooperation was also bearing fruit. Similar networks in other European countries were being rolled up based on intelligence gathered from the London arrests. What had started as a localized incident at Buckingham Palace was revealing itself to be part of a much larger international security operation. Marcus spent the rest of the morning in additional debriefings with intelligence, officers who were trying to piece together every detail of the attacker's behavior and coordination. His observations about their movements and communication during the fight were providing valuable insights into their training and background. The forensic analysis of the fake grenade had revealed sophisticated construction that suggested military or paramilitary expertise. The device had been designed to look authentic to trained security personnel, not just ordinary civilians. This indicated a level of technical knowledge that pointed to professional terrorist training. As the day progressed, Marcus found himself looking forward to seeing his family while simultaneously dreading having to explain why their lives had been disrupted. The balance between protecting them from worry and preparing them for the reality of their situation would require careful judgment. The drive to the safe house took him through parts of London he rarely visited, giving him time to process the enormous changes that 48 hours had brought to his life. Yesterday morning he had been a ceremonial guard with a routine job. Today he was at the center of an international security incident with his family under protective custody. The safe house was an unremarkable suburban home that gave no external indication of its true purpose. Inside, Marcus could hear the familiar voices of his wife and children, and for the first time since the crisis began, he felt like himself again. Walking through the front door of the safe house, Marcus was immediately enveloped in the familiar chaos of family life. His 7-year-old daughter Emma ran to him with arms outstretched, while his 9-year-old son James looked up from a video game with a mixture of excitement and confusion. Sarah appeared from the kitchen, her relief evident despite her attempt to maintain normalcy for the children. "Daddy, are we on a special holiday?" Emma asked, clinging to his legs. "The nice policeman said we get to stay in a different house for a few days." Marcus knelt down to her level, his heart breaking at her innocent trust. "Something like that, sweetheart. Daddy had to do some important work, and we want to make sure everyone stays safe while the grown-ups sort things out." James, being older and more perceptive, wasn't satisfied with such a simple explanation. "Dad, I saw you on the news. You were fighting those men at the palace. Are they going to come after us?" Sarah shot Marcus a warning look over the children's heads. They had agreed years ago to be honest with their children about his work, but age-appropriately so. The current situation tested that philosophy to its limits. "James, sometimes people make bad choices and try to hurt others," Marcus explained carefully. "My job is to stop that from happening. The police are just being extra careful to make sure everyone stays safe while they catch all the bad people." The protection officer assigned to the family, a competent woman named Detective Inspector Walsh, discreetly gestured for Marcus to join her in the kitchen. Sarah followed, leaving the children to continue their activities under the watchful eye of another officer. "Sir, I need to brief you on the current threat assessment," Walsh said quietly. "We've intercepted additional communications that suggest the threat against your family is more specific than initially thought." Marcus felt his jaw tighten. "What kind of communications?" "Encrypted messages between known extremist cells discussing you by name and mentioning your children's school. We believe they may have conducted surveillance of your normal routines before yesterday's attack." Sarah's face went pale. As a teacher herself, she understood better than most how vulnerable schools could be to someone with malicious intent. "How long have they been watching us?" "We're still analyzing the intelligence, but it appears they may have been gathering information for several weeks. Your children's safety was never in immediate danger, because the plan was always to wait until after the palace attack to move against families." Marcus processed this information with growing anger. The fact that strangers had been watching his children, learning their routines and planning to use them as weapons against him was beyond unacceptable. It transformed his professional duty into something deeply personal. "What are our options?" Marcus asked, forcing himself to focus on solutions rather than his emotional response. "Short term, you remain here under protection until we can roll up the rest of the network. Medium term, we may need to consider relocating your family permanently, depending on how widely your identity has been distributed among extremist groups." The word permanently hit Sarah like a physical blow. "You mean leave our home, our jobs, the children's school and friends?" "Hopefully not," Walsh replied gently. "But we have to consider all possibilities. Your husband's actions saved lives and disrupted a major terrorist operation. Unfortunately, that makes him a high-value target for retaliation." Marcus reached for Sarah's hand, drawing strength from her touch. Whatever we need to do to keep you and the children safe, we'll do. Everything else can be figured out later. Over the next hour, Walsh explained the security measures that would be in place for the foreseeable future. Armed protection officers would accompany the family whenever they left the safe house. Their normal routines would need to be varied and unpredictable. Communication with friends and extended family would be monitored and limited. For the children, the adjustment would be particularly difficult. Emma was young enough to accept the changes as an adventure, but James was beginning to understand that their lives had been fundamentally altered by his father's actions. The weight of that realization was crushing for Marcus. That evening, after the children had been put to bed in their temporary rooms, Marcus and Sarah sat together on the unfamiliar couch of the safe house. The television was showing continuing coverage of the terrorist plot that Marcus had helped uncover, with talking heads debating everything from government security policies to the role of the Royal Guard in modern Britain. "Do you regret it?" Sarah asked quietly. "If you had known what it would mean for us, would you have done anything differently?" Marcus considered the question seriously. In the heat of the moment, he had acted on instinct and training. But even with time to reflect, he couldn't imagine making different choices. "Those men would have killed innocent people," he said finally. "If not yesterday, then in whatever attack they planned next. Yes, our lives are complicated now, but other families still have their children because of what happened." Sarah nodded, though he could see the fear in her eyes. "I'm proud of you. Terrified, but proud. I just wish being a hero didn't come with such a high price." The next morning brought news that provided some hope for their situation. Intelligence services had arrested the remaining members of the London cell, based on information gathered from the palace attackers. More importantly, they had seized computer equipment that revealed the full extent of the surveillance conducted on Royal Guard families. Marcus was called back to headquarters for another debriefing, this time focused on the personal threats against him and his family. The intelligence picture was both encouraging and disturbing. The immediate threat appeared to be diminishing as more arrests were made, but the international nature of the network meant that new threats could emerge from unexpected directions. Colonel Richardson met with Marcus personally to discuss his future with the Royal Guard. "Thompson, I want to be frank with you. Your actions have made you a symbol, both positive and negative. Some see you as a hero who exemplified the best traditions of the Guard. Others view you as an agent of oppression who used excessive force against protesters." Marcus had expected this conversation. "Sir, what are my options?" "Several, actually. You could remain with the Royal Guard in a different capacity, perhaps training new recruits or working with intelligence services. You could transfer to another military unit where your experience would be valuable, or you could leave service entirely and start fresh with your family in a new location." Each option carried significant implications. Staying with the Guard meant continued high-profile visibility and potential ongoing threats. Transferring to another unit might provide some distance from the controversy, but would still leave him in the public eye. Leaving service entirely would mean abandoning a career he loved but might offer the best chance for his family to return to normal life. "I don't need to decide immediately, do I, sir? Take whatever time you need. The Guard owes you that much and more, but understand that every day you delay is another day your family remains under protection at considerable expense and inconvenience." That afternoon, Marcus returned to the safe house with more questions than answers. The children were adapting remarkably well to their temporary situation, but he could see the strain beginning to show in Sarah's eyes. The uncertainty of not knowing when or if they could return to their normal lives was taking its toll. As he watched his family trying to make the best of an impossible situation, Marcus realized that his greatest challenge wasn't behind him but ahead. The fight at the palace gates had lasted only minutes, but the consequences would reshape their lives for years to come. 3 months after the incident at Buckingham Palace, Marcus stood in the garden of a small cottage in the Cotswolds, watching his children play on a swing set that he had installed the previous weekend. The cottage was their new home, purchased under a different identity, as part of the witness protection program that had become necessary when international terrorist networks had placed bounties on his head. The final arrests in the terrorist network had been made 6 weeks earlier, but the threats against Marcus and his family had only intensified. Social media campaigns by extremist groups had turned him into a symbol of everything they opposed about Western governments and military forces. His face had appeared on wanted posters distributed through encrypted channels, with rewards offered for information about his location. Sarah emerged from the cottage carrying 2 cups of tea, her appearance subtly altered by a new hairstyle and hair color. That was part of their new identities. She had adapted to their changed circumstances with remarkable strength, though Marcus could see the toll that constant vigilance had taken on her. The spontaneous woman he had married had been replaced by someone who checked locks twice and never left the children unattended in public. "Any word from Colonel Richardson?" she asked, settling onto the garden bench beside him. Marcus nodded, pulling out an encrypted phone that was his only connection to his former life. The inquiry board reached their final conclusions. My actions were deemed not only appropriate but exemplary. They're recommending me for the George Cross. The George Cross was the highest civilian award for gallantry, rarely given to military personnel except in the most exceptional circumstances. It was recognition that Marcus's actions had gone far beyond normal military duty to something approaching heroism. "That's wonderful," Sarah said, though her tone lacked enthusiasm. "Will you have to appear publicly to receive it?" "That's the problem. A public ceremony would compromise our security completely. Richardson says they're willing to present it privately, but it means I can never publicly acknowledge receiving one of the highest honors in the British system." It was emblematic of their entire situation. Marcus had performed his duty with exceptional courage and skill, preventing what could have been a massacre and disrupting an international terrorist network. But the consequences of success had been almost as devastating as failure might have been. James and Emma had adapted to their new identities with the resilience of childhood, but Marcus could see the confusion in their eyes when they had to remember their new names and backstory. Emma, now going by the name Lucy, sometimes forgot and corrected people who used her new identity. James, calling himself David, had become quieter and more watchful, unconsciously mimicking the security awareness that had become second nature to his parents. The cottage itself was beautiful, a traditional Cotswold stone building with low ceilings and a thatched roof. But it was also a fortress equipped with sophisticated security systems and panic rooms that could be sealed in case of attack. Motion sensors covered the grounds, and neighbors who appeared to be simple retirees were actually armed protection officers maintaining constant surveillance. Marcus had found work as a security consultant, using his military experience to advise corporations on threat assessment and protection protocols. The work was interesting and well paid, but it felt hollow compared to the sense of purpose he had found in serving the crown. He missed the ceremony, the tradition, and the clear moral framework that had guided his life for over a decade. Sarah had been unable to return to teaching under her new identity due to the background checks required for education positions. Instead, she was working part-time for a local charity, finding some satisfaction in helping others while struggling with the loss of the career she had loved. The children attended a small village school where their academic abilities made them stand out among their classmates. Both had been accelerated students in London, but their new school lacked the resources to challenge them appropriately. Marcus worried about the long-term impact on their education and development. Financial compensation from the government was generous, and they wanted for nothing material. But money couldn't replace the life they had lost or the freedom they had surrendered. Every trip to the village required planning and approval from their protection detail. Spontaneous family outings were impossible. Contact with old friends was limited to carefully monitored communications that revealed nothing about their new location or circumstances. Marcus's phone buzzed with an encrypted message from Colonel Richardson. The text was brief but significant. Network leader captured in Pakistan. Threat level being reassessed. Possible pathway to partial normalization within 6 months. Hope flickered in Marcus's chest for the first time in weeks. If the leadership of the terrorist network had been eliminated, the organized threat against his family might finally be diminishing. It wouldn't mean an immediate return to their old lives, but it could be the beginning of a gradual emergence from the shadows. "Good news?" Sarah asked, noticing his expression. "Maybe. Richardson thinks the threat might be decreasing. It's not over, but there might be light at the end of the tunnel." Sarah's relief was visible, though she was too experienced now to celebrate prematurely. They had received false hope before, only to have new threats emerge from unexpected directions. The international nature of the terrorist network meant that eliminating one cell could simply activate another. That evening, after the children were asleep, Marcus and Sarah walked through their garden in the gathering dusk. The protection officers maintained their discreet surveillance from hidden positions, but for a few minutes, the couple could pretend they were simply enjoying a peaceful evening in the countryside. "Do you think we'll ever get our real lives back?" Sarah asked, voicing the question that haunted both of them. Marcus considered his answer carefully. The man who had stood guard at Buckingham Palace 3 months earlier would have given an optimistic response based on faith in the system and the eventual triumph of justice. The man he had become was more realistic about the long-term consequences of his actions. "I don't think we'll ever get our old lives back," he said finally, "but maybe we can build new ones that are just as good. Different, but good." Sarah nodded, accepting the honesty even though it wasn't what she wanted to hear. "The children are adapting better than I expected. Kids are resilient." "They shouldn't have to be," Marcus replied, the familiar guilt weighing on him. "This isn't the life I wanted to give them." "You gave them a father who stands up for what's right even when it costs him everything." "That's not nothing, Marcus. That's everything." Looking back at the cottage where his children slept safely, Marcus realized that Sarah was right. The choices he had made at the palace gates had indeed cost them everything they had known. But they had also defined who he was and what he stood for. In a world where it was easy to look away from danger and avoid difficult decisions, he had chosen to act. The George Cross that he would receive in secret was recognition not just of his courage in those crucial moments, but of his willingness to accept the consequences of doing what was right. History would remember the terrorist plot that was prevented and the lives that were saved. Only his family would know the price that victory had demanded. As they walked back toward the cottage, Marcus caught sight of James watching them from his bedroom window. The boy waved and Marcus waved back, making a silent promise that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together as a family. The Royal Guard had taught him to protect institutions and traditions, but his family had taught him what was truly worth protecting. The future remained uncertain, but Marcus Thompson, whatever name he was using, would continue to stand guard over the things that mattered most.